At midnight, I felt someone's touch on my body. Whoever it was, he was gently and lovingly caressing me. At first, I smiled at what I assumed was my husband's affectionate touch. But then the caresses grew more brazen and overwhelming, and I began to feel a strange intoxication. Suddenly, I became terrified because that touch was not from my husband. The scent did not belong to him. I was deeply shaken. If it was not my husband, then who could it be? On that first night, I remained silent because I did not know who the person was or how he had even entered my room, and I could not utter a word without seeing him first. I thought maybe it was my husband. If I had blurted out any rash words and it turned out to be him, my married life could have been jeopardized, and he might have reacted with anger and suspicion, accusing me of having relations with another man. So at first I wanted to carefully determine who this person was before I reacted. The next morning, when the sun rose, I examined everything very carefully. I took out all of my husband's perfumes and smelled them one by one, but none carried the scent I had experienced the previous night. I inspected my room and my bed meticulously, but there was no evidence or any marks indicating that anyone other than my husband had been there. Yet that night, when the unfamiliar touch returned, it was completely alien to me, and I became frightened once more. I tried to push the intruder away, and in a trembling voice I managed to ask, "Who is here?" But there was no response to my question, which only deepened my doubts. Then he placed his hand on my face, and in a strange, heavy tone said, "Do not disturb me. Let me do what I am doing." In that moment, I realized that this voice was definitely not my husband's. It was as unfamiliar as the touch itself. I tried repeatedly to push him back, to shake off this unwelcome presence, but my drowsiness made it impossible for me to resist. After a short while, the stranger finally withdrew, and I drifted off into sleep once again. This unsettling occurrence began to happen almost every other day, sometimes even every third day. I started to feel convinced that it was not my husband at all, but some unknown man, a man I did not even know, who was invading my privacy. I knew my husband's touch and his scent so well that I could easily tell the difference. Sometimes I would clearly recognize his distinct perfume, and other times that very scent completely foreign, leaving me bewildered and disturbed. For the past several days, this problem had troubled me. In the evenings after sunset, I could not see him at all. A few days ago, my husband even took me to a doctor. The doctor told me that this condition was normal and temporary, and that I would soon recover. His comforting words somewhat eased my worries. Despite that, many nights I still heard the sound of a door opening. At those moments, I never knew where my husband had gone or why he was absent from the room. It had become a regular habit for him to disappear at night for unknown reasons. Until recently, I had slept soundly, and my vision had not failed me. But that night I experienced a terrifying dream, and I woke up suddenly with my heart pounding as if it were a drum. I looked beside me and discovered that my husband was nowhere to be seen. In a state of panic, I left my room and searched the entire house. To my dismay, I could not find him anywhere. He often acted in this mysterious way, and whenever I questioned him about his whereabouts, he would simply say that he was right there, leaving me confused and anxious. The strange and unfamiliar touch I felt, especially at night, continued to haunt me. I was increasingly disturbed by the sensation that someone else might be in my room, even when my husband was supposed to be present. I tried repeatedly to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding, that perhaps my husband's absence was the reason I experienced these strange sensations. I reassured myself by thinking that no one could possibly enter the room while my husband was there. Yet, deep down, I remained unsettled. My mind raced with questions. Why did I feel such a foreign touch on my body? Who was this unknown person who dared to invade my space in the presence of my husband's supposed presence? I considered the possibility that these experiences were merely a figment of my imagination. But then I recalled the clear and distinct smell that accompanied the touch, a scent I did not recognize at all as my husband's. At home, besides my husband, there were only my father-in-law and my younger brother-in-law, both treating me with great respect and love. My younger brother-in-law was like a brother, and my father-in-law like a father. How could I think ill of them? Yet the unfamiliar touch and scent were strange. I wondered who could enter my room in my husband's presence. I tried to rationalize these events, telling myself that no one could enter while my husband was there. Still, his recurring midnight disappearances troubled me, and I even thought that in his absence, someone unknown might slip into the room. It might also be just my delusion. He is my husband, but the question was, why does his scent often become unfamiliar to me? I felt as if I were going mad from all this thinking. I was suffering from this affliction and longed to recover quickly. I used the medicines given by the doctors, and they said that due to weakness this was happening to me, that with these medicines I would be completely fine. They explained that many people experience something similar when the sun sets. They say it is like night blindness. The doctor's hopeful words filled me with optimism. That day I hurriedly prepared dinner, knowing that after the evening, I might lose my sight and be unable to do anything. I had cooked the meal and even made fresh bread, keeping it in the hot pot. As time passed, my vision returned to normal, and everything seemed clear once again. Even though a long time had passed, my sight did not fail me, and I was very happy that this illness had finally released me from its grip. I wanted to share my joy with my family, but then I laughed to myself, realizing that if I were to announce my recovery to them, I might never be able to reach the person who was doing all this to me. What was true and what was false had to be decided today. So I kept the truth hidden and did not let anyone know that I could see again. I lay on the bed as usual, and the night passed quietly. That day, my husband did not go out. He was busy messaging someone on his mobile phone. When I peeked at his phone, I saw that he was talking to a girl, and from the way he spoke, it seemed as though that girl was very close to his heart, that he loved her very much. There was a lively smile on his face and a sparkle of joy in his eyes. Seeing all this, my heart broke terribly. I had been his wife for a year, yet he had never looked at me or spoken to me with such affection. Tears filled my eyes and I turned over on the bed. My heart was shattered. I felt betrayed and hurt. I did not want to let him sense even the slightest suspicion that I doubted him. If he discovered my suspicions, I would not be able to catch that person with my own hands, nor would I ever know where he went in the middle of the night or what he did. With that thought, I tried to sleep. The next day passed in busyness, and in the evening, I returned to my room and lay down once again. Later that day, after dinner, my husband came back to our room as usual. He was busy talking on the phone with someone, and around midnight he got up and left the room. I wanted to follow him, but then I paused and thought, the unknown presence only entered the room after my husband left, and now I wanted to see who that person was and how he had the audacity to do this to me. I closed my eyes and lay down, waiting for a long time. About half an hour later, I heard footsteps outside the door. My heart began to beat loudly. The door closed, and I heard someone walking toward me. Then, that person came and sat down beside me. I am left with many questions about that mysterious presence. Sometimes I felt a touch on my body at night that was not my husband's, and sometimes I sensed a familiar scent that suddenly turned strange. I could always recognize my husband's touch and smell, and yet there were moments when his distinct perfume would seem alien. I was tormented by the thought that perhaps I was losing my mind, and this illness was driving me to despair. I wondered whether it was merely my imagination or if someone else was indeed entering my room. My mind raced with questions. If it was not my husband, then who could it be? Could it be that in his absence, another man had come in? I recalled that at home there were only my husband, my father-in-law, and my younger brother-in-law, both of whom treated me with great respect and love. My younger brother-in-law was like a brother to me, and my father-in-law like a father. How could anyone else enter my room in their presence? Yet the unfamiliar touch and scent haunted me, and I began to feel an indescribable terror at night. At times when I awoke in the middle of the night, I found myself confused by the absence of my husband. I would search around the room only to be left with more questions. One night after he had left, I heard that strange sound again, a soft yet persistent touch on my skin that was both comforting and alarming. I tried to convince myself that it might be a trick of my mind, but the sensation was too real. I remembered the doctor's words, that many people experience temporary night blindness or similar symptoms after sunset. Yet this was different. The fear and confusion kept returning every night, making me feel increasingly isolated and desperate for an explanation. I started to question if this was all just a delusion caused by my weakness, or if there truly was another presence in the room. I longed to understand the truth, but every time I tried to follow my husband, I was met with silence and an eerie absence that left me trembling. I even considered the possibility that my own mind was playing tricks on me, but then I recalled the distinct and unfamiliar scent, the very scent that I had never known to belong to my husband. It was as if a part of him had been replaced by someone unknown. That night I lay in bed, heart pounding and mind racing with doubts and fears. I felt torn between the comforting memories of my husband's familiar touch and the terrifying sensation of an unknown caress that seemed to come in his absence. I kept thinking that if it were truly my husband, his scent would always be familiar, and his touch would never feel alien. Yet the experience was so vivid and persistent that I could not shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided then that I would not let these unsettling experiences go unanswered. I resolved to stay awake and watch him closely, hoping that by confronting my fears, I might discover the truth behind these nightly disturbances. My determination grew stronger with every passing night, even as I tried to remain calm and rational. I questioned every little sound, every faint movement in the dark, and the uncertainty gnawed at me like a relentless force. In my heart, I knew that if it were indeed my husband, then his actions were inexplicable and hurtful. And if it were not him, then who could be so bold as to enter our room while he was away? These thoughts haunted me constantly, leaving me in a state of perpetual anxiety. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more confused I became, and my sleep was often interrupted by nightmares of betrayal and intrusion. As the days went by, the episodes continued, each one leaving me more distressed than the last. I clung to the hope that one day the mystery would be solved and that I would regain the peace I once knew. I took comfort in the fact that the doctor had assured me this was a temporary condition, a weakness that would soon pass. But deep inside, I feared that the truth might be far more complex and painful than I was ready to face. Then on another night, much like the others, after dinner when my husband returned to the room and spent his time on the phone, I lay awake, waiting for that unknown presence to reveal itself once more. As the night grew late, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching my door. My heart pounded in my ears as I held my breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door closed and someone walked over to me and sat down beside me. Then he sat down beside me. For a long time, I felt the warmth of someone's gaze on my face. Yet I lay there with my eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Then suddenly, his hand began to caress me, and when his bold advances grew more persistent, my tolerance finally wore thin. I abruptly opened my eyes, and what I saw left me utterly shattered. My mouth kept letting out screams as I realized that the person was none other than my younger brother-in-law, whose incessant, provocative remarks were as relentless as if he were calling me sister-in-law. He was now trying to trifle with my honor. Even as I opened my eyes, he did not seem to be fazed. He appeared to think that I was still under the influence of my condition. Rising from where I lay, I delivered a resounding slap to his face. He stared at me in disbelief, unable to comprehend that I could act in such a manner toward him. He never imagined that my vision had returned. I watched him uncertainly for a long while before I said, "Have you no shame? How can you sully your brother's honor by behaving like this with your sister-in-law?" When he realized that I knew everything, he grew frightened and collapsed at my feet, begging for forgiveness. "Please forgive me," he pleaded, "and do not tell anyone about this, or our brother and father will expel you from the house." I joined my hands in supplication as he continued sobbing, asking for pardon. The rage and loathing I felt surged within me, and I was overwhelmed by intense bitterness. I could never, ever bring myself to tell my husband about this. If I had, who knows what treatment I might have received. Perhaps I would have been deemed guilty, or worse, cast aside completely. I had driven him out of the room, and as he left, he kept apologizing repeatedly, whispering that I must never disclose what had happened. A throbbing headache pounded in my head, and I was filled with immense anger. Anger not only at my brother-in-law, but also at my husband, whose absence allowed all this to occur. The very man who was supposed to guard my honor, my lifelong companion, had mysteriously vanished at midnight. It was as if he had abandoned me completely. For a long while that night, I could not understand why he left. At dawn, when he finally returned, I did not confront him immediately. Instead, I lay back down, still trembling with sorrow and disbelief. I longed to seize him with my own hands, to confront him about his betrayal, but I withheld my anger, afraid of the consequences of his reactions. I had not told him that my sight had returned, and now I waited in anticipation, determined to catch him red-handed, to see where he went and what he did throughout the day. The next day after dinner as usual, my husband re-entered our room. He was continuously busy talking on the phone, and near midnight he rose and left the room again. I wanted to follow him, but then I paused and thought, the person who intrudes into my room always appears only after my husband leaves. Now I resolved to observe him, to discover his identity, and to understand how he dared act in such a manner. I closed my eyes and lay back down, waiting for a long time. After about half an hour, I began to hear the sound of footsteps outside the door. My heart pounded fiercely as I listened. The door closed and I heard someone approaching me. Then that person sat down beside me. For quite some time, I felt the heat of that stranger's gaze on my face. Even though I kept my eyes closed and pretended to sleep, I could sense his persistent scrutiny. Soon his hand began to wander over my skin, and when his brazen touches increased, I could bear no more. I jerked open my eyes, and what I saw left me utterly devastated. My mouth kept letting out screams as I realized that it was my younger brother-in-law, whose provocative tongue, as if he were constantly teasing me by calling me sister-in-law, seemed to be testing my honor. He assumed I was still under the effects of my previous ailment. Rising from my place, I struck him hard across the face. He stared at me in shock, not believing that I could do this to him. He had no inkling that my vision had returned. I looked at him for a long time with a mixture of disbelief and fury before I told him, "Aren't you ashamed? How can you disgrace your brother's honor by behaving this way with your sister-in-law?" Realizing that I knew everything, he cowered, falling at my feet and begging for forgiveness. "Please, forgive me. Do not tell anyone about this, or I fear our brother and father will banish you from our home." My anger grew boundless as I listened to his pitiful pleas, and I felt a deep, searing hatred toward him. I could never tell my husband about this incident. If I did, I feared he might treat me as if I were the cause of all our misfortunes. I drove him out of my room with firm resolve, yet even as he left, he kept murmuring apologies, pleading that I keep silent about the incident. I was left with the burning question in my heart. How could my husband, the very man who was meant to protect my honor, abandon me and leave me to suffer such betrayal? How could he go to another woman, leaving me broken and alone? I was cherishing the day when I loved my husband, when I adored him, when our long-distance relationship had brought us together, and we studied side by side at university. We both loved each other very much. When I expressed my affection to my parents, they tried to dissuade me. They said that this man was in no way worthy of me. My parents did not like him at all, and even my brother said that he was not a good person, that he had been involved with several girls and had deceived many. But I believed otherwise. I thought that Zane was the truest man in the world and that no one could ever love me more than he did. Because of my steadfast belief, I boldly stood before my family and declared that if I were ever to marry, it would only be to Zane. I could never even consider anyone else. Reluctantly, my parents agreed, and despite my brother's protest that I was about to make the worst decision of my life, I could see no one but Zane. I believed that all their anger would soon pass, that people eventually forget. However, just a few months into our marriage, I began to realize that my decision might have been a mistake. My husband had changed completely. He no longer cared for me at all. He paid no attention to my needs or my words. His world had become his own, a realm filled with his busy schedule, his friends, and his own pursuits. He even had not yet ceased his flirtations and maintained relationships with several other girls. Witnessing all this, I grew increasingly resentful inside. Whenever I tried to stop him, he would instead scold me harshly, calling me a suspicious and deluded woman who was ruining his life with her doubts. Hearing such accusations, I fell silent, for it was my own decision, and I could not blame anyone else. My mother, when she saw my disheartened face, would say, "We warned you not to marry this man. He is not at all worthy of you." But I dismissed her words. I told her that she was mistaken, that my husband was a good man who loved me dearly. I did not want anyone to know that I was unhappy, even though deep down I felt that nothing could salvage what was lost. I clung to a fragile hope that maybe my husband would one day appreciate me again and love me as he once did. Yet when I saw him that day, leaving for that other woman's house with my own eyes, my tolerance had finally reached its limit. That night after our meal, I lay on the bed waiting for my husband as usual. Soon my mind filled with memories of happier times when I loved him and he was my entire world. I recalled the passion of our early days, the tender moments in the university corridors, and the promises we made to each other. But those days had long since faded away, replaced by a harsh reality. My husband had grown distant, and his actions spoke louder than his words ever could. I tried to convince myself that his neglect and infidelities were temporary lapses, but each passing day deepened my pain. I began to notice that whenever he left the room at night, I would sense an unfamiliar presence. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a side effect of my fragile state. But then I began to experience strange sensations, occasional touches, and fleeting scents that did not match my husband's known fragrance. I recalled with a sinking heart the nights when I felt a touch that was neither gentle nor familiar, when a voice that was not his whispered in the dark, leaving me shrouded in doubt and misery. I spent many sleepless nights wrestling with these unsettling feelings, unable to tell if they were mere illusions or real intrusions into our life. My mind was torn between the love I once had and the betrayal I now felt. I desperately clung to memories of the man I had loved, even as I wondered if he had become a stranger. I feared that if I confronted him, I might shatter the little hope that still remained. Yet the sight of him visiting another woman, a young widow living in the neighboring house, brought a fresh wave of agony. I watched in horror as he entered her home in the middle of the night, a place where he was not supposed to be. The realization that he was engaged in yet another affair pushed me to the brink of despair. After that fateful night, I lay awake on the bed, heart pounding and eyes heavy with tears. I resolved to keep a careful watch over him, to learn where he went and what he did when he was away from me. I wanted to catch him in the act, to finally know the truth about his betrayals. The pain of his infidelity was compounded by the fact that I could not even share my sorrow with him, for I feared that revealing my suspicions would only lead to further accusations against me. My mind was filled with conflicting emotions: love, anger, betrayal, and sorrow, each vying for dominance over my heart. Then just before dawn, my husband returned home. I sat on the bed waiting silently for him. For a fleeting moment, he glanced at me, his eyes betraying a hint of surprise, but then he turned away and lay down as if nothing had happened. At that moment, I decided I could no longer remain silent. I must confront him, demand an explanation for his behavior, and reclaim my dignity. Yet my resolve was clouded by the fear of further rejection and the bitter taste of betrayal that had already shattered my trust. Finally, when I gathered enough courage, I spoke in a firm, cold tone, asking him where he had been and what he was doing. He paused, momentarily startled, then composed himself and said, "Where are you coming from?" Seeing this, he was momentarily shocked, then composed himself and said, "What do you mean by that? What does it have to do with you?" I had gone on an important errand. I had gone to meet a friend. I had struggled very hard to compose my thoughts and appear normal. He said that one of his friends had met with an accident and that he had been there. At that moment, my tolerance ran out. "Then why did you go to Alishba's house?" he demanded, his eyes widening in astonishment as he looked at me. I told him, "My vision has started returning. I am now fine. Today, when you left the house, I followed you, and I saw you going to Alishba's house even though she was alone. There is no man in her house. What business did you have there?" For a moment, he fell silent. Then he replied, That is my personal life. Do whatever you want. You have no right to question me. At his extreme insolence, I screamed at him, "How can you be so shameless? How can you sully your brother's honor by behaving like this with your sister-in-law?" Hearing my words, he stood there dumbfounded, unable to believe what I was saying. Then I told him everything about my younger brother-in-law. On hearing that, he became furious. All the blood seemed to drain from his face as anger took over. He began to leave the room in a rage. But I stopped him and said, "What are you angry about? You used to trifle with other people's honor, trampling on it without a second thought. And now the same thing is happening to you. Instead of restraining your own brother, ask yourself, why, in the middle of the night, did you leave the house as a husband and abandon me to go to another woman's side?" He replied weakly, "When you forsake what is lawful for that which is forbidden, this is what happens." He spoke as if reminding me of a well-known sin. He knew full well that those who abandon their spouses for illicit pleasures end up feasting on foul, disgusting meals instead of enjoying fresh, good food in the presence of their wives. He added, "It is the very people who have their wives by their side and share a legitimate bond with them who would never behave as you did, and yet you chose to forsake that honor." My words had a profound impact on him. Soon he burst into tears, crying uncontrollably as he confessed, "I have made a terrible mistake. I should not have done this." He insisted that he always believed his wife was very good and virtuous, that she would never do anything wrong. Yet sadly, even my own younger brother-in-law had violated my honor in my absence, and the loss could not be diminished in any way. For when one leaves his honor to be trampled upon in the darkness of night by another, eventually he ends up sending his younger brother away from the country. As long as my younger brother-in-law remained here, nobody even spoke to him. He kept pleading for forgiveness over and over, crying continuously, but no one's heart softened for him. After he left, my husband suddenly became entirely different. He never once raised his eyes to look at another girl again. But forgetting what had happened to me was not so easy. I remember that day when I used to cherish every moment when I loved my husband, when I adored him, when our long-distance relationship had brought us together and we attended university together. We both loved each other deeply. When I expressed my fondness to my parents, they tried to stop me. They said that this man was in no way worthy of me. My parents did not like him at all, and even my brother said that he was not a good man, that he had been involved with many girls and had deceived them. But I believed all those things were false. I thought that Zane was the truest man in the world, that no one could ever love me as much as he did. Because of this belief, I boldly stood up before my family and declared that if I were ever to marry, it would only be Zane. I could not even think of anyone else. Due to my stubbornness, my parents eventually relented, and they agreed to the match despite my brother's protest, who claimed I was making the worst decision of my life. I was convinced that I could not see anyone else but Zane. I thought that everyone's anger was only temporary, that soon they would all forget. However, just a few months into our marriage, I began to realize that my decision was a mistake. My husband had completely changed. He no longer cared for me at all. He did not pay attention to any of my needs or even listen to my words. His life had become his own, filled with his busy schedule, his friends, and his numerous extra relationships with different girls. All of this made me suffer inside. Every time I tried to stop him, he would scold me, calling me a suspicious and deluded woman, saying that I was ruining his life with my doubts. I was forced to remain silent, even as my heart was breaking inside. My mother would look at my disheartened face and say, "We warned you not to marry this man. He is not at all worthy of you." But I brushed aside her words. I told her that she was mistaken, that my husband was a good man who loved me deeply. I never wanted to let anyone know how unhappy I was, even though I felt that nothing could change the fact. I hoped that one day he would realize my worth and love me again. But when I saw him with his eyes entering the house of another woman, I reached my breaking point. That night after dinner, I lay on the bed waiting for him. In the quiet darkness, I could barely contain my pain and despair. My heart ached as I recalled all the memories of love and the promises we once shared. Yet now I could no longer ignore the betrayal. When he left the room that night, I resolved that I would confront him and demand answers. I could no longer allow his actions to go unchallenged. But even as I resolved to face him, the pain of his infidelity and the bitter taste of betrayal were too overwhelming to forget. But forgetting what had happened to me was not so easy.